go ahead and start and have some fun by yourselves. All right. So I'm gonna go back paragraph. We're gonna close this out. Hey, what's up? What's up? So let's go back a couple paragraphs. We were talking about colonialism as a system for underdeveloping Africa and also how it develops the Europeans, Western societies and stuff. Let's see here. Yeah. In North Africa, handicraft industries have made the greatest advances before colonialism in spheres ranging from brasswork to woolens. As the towns of feudal Europe, craft shops flourished in Algerian towns like Oran, Constantine, and Algiers, and Telmessine. But French colonialism destroyed the handicraft industries and threw thousands out of work. The same thing had happened in Europe itself when new machines threw artisans out of employment in places like Lancashire, Lyons, Sons, what? Like Lancashire and Lyons. This doesn't make sense. Hold on. Okay, there it is. But in that instance, the new machines became the basis of the prevailing mode of production, and formerly independent artisans returned to factories as proletarians to master different skills and expand the productive capacity of their society. In Africa, it was simply destruction without redress. By the time political independence was achieved, surviving craftsmanship had been turned towards attracting tourists rather than meeting the real needs of African people. Besides, as was true for the European slave trade, the destruction of technology under colonialism must be related to the barriers raised in the path of African initiative. The vast majority of Africans drawn into a colonial money economy were simply providing manual labor, which stimulated perspiration rather than scientific initiative. Africans connected to the trade sector were sometimes successful in a limited way. The resourcefulness of West African market women as well. Resourcefulness of West African market women as well known, but it was put to pretty purposes. The problem posed to capitalists and workers in Europe while making insecticide from African pyrethrum was one requiring that resourcefulness be expressed in the technical direction. But the problem posed to an African market women by the necessity to make a penny more profit on every 10 of imported sardines was resolved sometimes by a little more vigor, sometimes by a touch of dishonesty, and sometimes by resorting to quote-unquote juju. Colonialism induced the African iron worker to abandon the process of extracting iron from the soil and to concentrate instead on working scraps of metals imported from Europe. The only compensation for that interruption would have been the provision of modern techniques in the extraction of and processing of iron. However, those techniques are debarred from Africa on the basis of international division of labor imperialism. Division of labor under imperialism, as was seen earlier, in non-industrialization of Africa was not left to chance. It was deliberately enforced by stopping the transference of Africa of machinery and skills, which would have given competition to European industry in that epoch. In the period of African development preceding colonialism, some areas moved faster than others and provided the nuclei for growth on a wide regional basis. Northern Nigeria was one of those. It virtually went to sleep during the colonial period. The British cut it off from the rest of the Muslim world and fossilized the social relations so that the serfs could not achieve any change in the expense of the ruling aristocracy. On every continent and within nation states, some features of growth were always more outstanding than others, and thereby offered a lead to the rest of society. The towns played that role in late feudal European societies, while the electrical industry was an example of a similar impetus from development in the metropolitan capitalist societies in the first decades of this century. Colonialism provided Africa with no real growth points. For instance, the colonial town in Africa was essentially a center of administration rather than industry. Towns did attract large numbers of Africans, but only to offer them a very unstable life based on unskilled and irregular employment. European towns had slums, but the squalor of towns in underdeveloped countries is a special phenomenon. It was a consequence of the inability to those towns to play the role of expanding the productive base. Fortunately, Africa was never as badly off in this respect as Asia and Latin America. Instead of speeding up growth, colonial activities such as mining and cash crop farming sped up the decay of, quote, traditional, end quote, African life. In many parts of the continent, vital aspects of culture were adversely affected. Nothing better was substituted, and only a lifeless shell was left. The capitalist forces behind colonialism were interested in little more than the exploitation of labor. Even areas that were not directly involved in the money economy exploited labor. In extracting that labor, what are you doing with this? What are you doing? Go lay down or something, please. Sorry, buddy. Let me go back. Even the areas that were not directly involved in money economy, exploiting labor, the extracting that labor that tempered with the factor that was the very buttress of the society of African traditional life, when deprived of its customary labor force and patterns of work, was no longer traditional, quote unquote. During the colonial era, hold on a second, everybody. What are you doing, dude? Come on, go out there, go out there if you want. Don't know why you're going out there. During the colonial era, I have to go check on him, everybody. Hold on a second. He acts like he... Probably gonna puke. This is having an upset stomach, everybody. Sorry about that. During the colonial era, many thinly populated villages appeared in Central and Southern Africa, comprising women, children, and old men. They practiced subsistence agriculture, which was not productive enough, and the colonialists contrast them with cash crop areas, which in comparison were flourishing. However, it was precisely the impact of colonialism which left so many villages deserted and starving because the able-bodied males had gone off to labor elsewhere. Any district deprived of each effective laboring population could not be expected to develop. All right, I think something happened, everybody. Give me a moment, if you don't mind. Let's try this again. Sorry, everybody. Sorry about that. Had to clean up a mess. Instead of speeding up the growth, colonial activities such as mining and cash crop farming sped up the decay of traditional African life. In many parts of the continent, vital aspects of culture were adversely affected. Nothing better was substituted, and only a lifeless shell was left. The capitalist forces behind colonialism were interested in little more than the exploitation of labor. Even areas that were not directly involved in money economy exploited labor. And extracting that labor, they tempered with the factor that was the very buttress of the society of African traditional life, when deprived of its customary labor force and patterns of work, was no longer traditional, quote unquote. During the colonial era, many thinly populated villages appeared in Central and Southern Africa, comprising women, children, and old men. They practiced subsistence agriculture, which was not productive enough, and the colonialists contrasted them with cash crop areas, which in comparison were flourishing. However, it was precisely the impact of colonialism which left so many villages deserted and starving, because the able-bodied males had gone off to labor elsewhere. Any district deprived of its effective laboring population could not be expected to develop. There were several spots within different colonies which were sufficiently far removed from town and colonial administration that they neither grew cash crops nor supplied labor. In southern Sudan, for instance, there were populations who continued to live a life not dissimilar to that which they had followed in previous centuries. Yet even for such traditional African societies, the scope for development no longer existed. They were isolated by the hold in which the colonialists had on the rest of the continent. They could not interact with other parts of Africa. They were subjects to increasing encroachment by the money economy and were more and more to be regarded as historical relics. The classical example of this type of obstructed historical development is to be found in the United States, where the indigenous population of indigenous, who, they use the I word, who survived slaughter by the whites, were placed in reservations and condemned to stagnation. Indigenous reservations in North America were living museums to visit the white tourist who purchased curios. I don't know what that is. We're going to find out what that word is. Oh, I'm sorry, everybody, that I had to fix something. So whoever's here, thank you for staying. Not too many people. Let me look up this word, everybody. Make sure I'm saying it right. What up, commie cowboy? CURIOS. A rare, unusual, or intriguing object. Curios. In southern Africa and Rhodesia, the policy of establishing, quote, native reserves, end quote, was openly followed. Inside the reserve, the major means of production was the land, but the quantity and fertility of the land associated with entirely inadequate to support the numbers of Africans who were driven in. The The reserves were reservoirs of cheap labor and dumping grounds for those who could not be accommodated within the money economy for the racist southern section of Africa. Further north, there were no areas named as reserves, quote unquote, except in colonial Kenya and to a very limited extent in Tanganyika. But the money economy was constantly transforming the traditional sectors into one which was just as deprived as any reserves. The money economy of colonialism was a growing sector that is not to be denied. However, it has already been indicated how limited that growth was, viewing over the continent as a whole. The growth in the so-called modern sectors exercised adverse effects on the non-monetary sector. What remains is to emphasize that the character of growth in Africa under colonialism was such that it did not constitute development, i.e., it did not enlarge the capacity of the society to deal with the natural environment, to educate relations between members of the society, and to protect the population from external forces. Such a statement is already implicitly born out of the inability of capitalism to stimulate skilled labor in colonial Africa. A system which must stand in the way of the accumulation of skills does not develop anything or any, so that even though the volume of commercial activity within each compartmentalized colony may have increased, there was no development comparable to that which linked together the various states of the United States. In recent times, economists have been recognizing in colonial and post-colonial Africa a pattern that has been termed, quote, growth without development, end quote. That phrase has now appeared as the title of a book in Liberia and Ivory Coast. It means that goods and services of a certain type are on the increase. There may be more rubber and coffee export. There may be more car imported in the process, and there may be more gasoline stations built to service the cars. But the profit goes abroad, and the economy becomes more and more a dependency of the metropoles. And no African colony was there economic integration of any provisions from making the economy self-sustained and geared to its own logical goals. Therefore, there was growth in the so-called enclave import-export sectors, but the only things which developed were dependency and underdevelopment. A further revelation of growth without development under colonialism was the interdependency the over-dependency, on one or two exports. The term, quote, monoculture, end quote, is used to describe those colonial economies which are centered around a single crop. Liberia in the agricultural sector was a monoculture dependent on rubber. Gold Coast on cocoa, Dahomey and Southeast Nigeria in palm produce, Sudan on cotton, Tanganyika on sesame, and Uganda on cotton. The Senegals and Gambian groundnuts accounted for 85 to 90% of money earnings. In effect, 2 African colonies were told to grow nothing but peanuts. Every farming people have a staple food plus a variety of other supplements. Historian agronomists, I can't say this word. I'm going to figure out what it means. I need you to stop licking your paws, buddy. It's not going to help you. Come on. I know the word, I just can't say it. So hold on a second. A Agronomist, which is an expert in the science of soil management and crop production. Agronomist and the botanist have all contributed to showing the great variety of such foods within the pre-colonial African economy. There were numerous crops which were domesticated within the African continent. There were several wild food spices, notably fruits, and Africans had shown no conservatism in adopting useful food plants of Asia or American origins. Diversified agriculture was within the African tradition. Monoculture was a colonial's invention. Those who justify the colonial division of labor suggest that it was natural and respected the relative capacity for specialization of the metropoles and the colonies. Europe, North America, and Japan were capable of specializing in industry, and Africa in agriculture. Therefore, it was to the comparative advantage, quote unquote, of the part of the world to manufacture machines while another part engaged in simple whole culture of the soil. That kind of arrogant partition of the world was not new. In the 15th century, the feudal... Hold on, everybody. Hold on. Oh my God. All right. That kind of arrogant partition of the world was not new. In the 15th century, the feudal monarchies of Portugal and Spain wanted the whole world for themselves, and they got the Pope to draw up lines around the globe, making the allocations, making the... Yeah. I'm gonna make sure this is right. This other word. Sorry, everybody. Where'd it go? A-L-L-O. I probably have it right. I just want to make sure. Allocation. Yeah, I had it right. Allocations. But Britain, Holland, and France suggested that they were not at all convinced that Adam had left, and will which gave the earth to Portugal and Spain. In like matter, it can be questioned whether there is any testament which stated that the river of Gambia should inherit groundnuts growing while the river Clyde of Scotland should become a home of shipbuilding. There was nothing natural, quote unquote, about monoculture. It was a consequence of imperialism, requirements, and mechanization extended. Hold on a second. Stop. Mechanization extended into areas that were politically independent in name. Monoculture was a characteristic of region falling under imperialist domination. Certain countries in Latin America, such as Costa Rica and Guatemala, were forced by United States capitalist firms to concentrate so heavily on growing bananas that they were contemptuously known as, quote, banana republic, end quote. In Africa, this concentration on one or two cash crops for sale abroad had many harmful effects. Sometimes cash crops were grown to the exclusion of staple foods. thus causing famines. For instance, in Gambia, rice farming was popular before the colonial era, but so much of the best land was transferred to groundnuts that rice had to be imported on the large scale to try to counter the fact that famine was becoming endemic. In Shanti, concentration of on cocoa raised fears of famine in a region previously famous for yams and other foodstuff. Yet the threat of famine was a small disadvantage compared to the extreme vulnerability and insecurity of monoculture. When the crop was affected by internal factors such as disease that amount to the overwhelming disasters, as in the case of Gold Coast cocoa, then it was hit by swollen shots disease in 1940s. Besides, at all times, the price fluctuated, which was externally controlled, left the African producer helpless in the face of capitalist maneuvers. From the capitalist viewpoint, monoculture commended themselves most because they made colonial economies entirely dependent on the metropolitan buyers of their produce. At the end of the European slave trade, only a minority of Africans were sufficiently committed to capitalist exchange and sufficiently dependent upon European imports to wish to continue the relationship with Europe at all costs. Colonialism increased the dependency of Africa on Europe in terms of the numbers of persons brought into the money economy and in terms of the number of aspects of socio-economic life in Africa, which derived their existence from the connections with the metropoles. The ridiculous situation arose by which European trading firms, mining companies, ship lines, banks, insurance houses, and plantations all exploited Africa, and at the same time caused Africans to feel that without those capitalist services, no money or European goods would be forthcoming, and therefore Africa was in debt to its exploiters. The factor of dependency made its impact felt in every aspect of the life of the colonies, and it can be regarded as a crowning vice among the negative social, political, and economic consequences of colonialism in Africa, being primarily responsible for the perpetuation of the colonial relationship into the epoch that is called neocolonialism. Finally, attention must be drawn to one of the most important consequences of colonialism in African development, and that is the stunting effect of Africans as a physical species. Colonialism created conditions which led not just to periodic famine, but to chronic undernourishment, malnutrition, and deterioration in the physique of the African people. If such a statement sounds widely extravagant, let me find this word out too. I wish I was better with words. EXTRV. Extravagant? Extravagant. It's extravagant. Widely extravagant. It is only because bourgeois propaganda was conditioned even Africans to believe that malnutrition and starvation were a natural lot of Africans from time immemorial. A black child with a transparent rib cage, a huge head, bloated stomach, protruding eyes, and twigs as arms and legs was a favorite poster of a large British charitable operation known as Oxfam. The poster represented a case of here we go. Let me see. Kwashiorkor extreme melanated malnutrition. Oxfam called upon the people of Europe to save the starving African and Asian children from Kwashiorkor. I can't say the word. I'm gonna look what it means though. I can't say the word. I will spell it out loud as I spell it on the thing. It's KWASHIORKOR. That's what it says. It is a severe form of malnutrition caused by a protein deficient diet, primarily affecting children. All right. As such ills, Oxfam never bothered their consciousness to tell them that capitalism and colonialism created the starvation, suffering, and misery of the children in the first place. There is an excellent study of the phenomenon of hunger on the world scale by the Brazilian scientist Josuan de Castro. It incorporates considerable data on the food and health conditions among Africans in their independent pre-colonial state or in societies untouched by capitalist pressures, and it then makes comparison with colonial conditions. The study convincingly indicates that the African diet was previously more varied, being based on the more diversified culture than was possible under colonialism. In terms of specific nutritional deficiency, those Africans who suffered most under colonialism were those who were brought most fully into colonial economy, namely the urban worker. For the sake of the doubters, several of Dr. Castro's observations were listed below, occasionally supplemented by other data. Number one, investors who have studied the nutritional conditions of, he says, primitive, quote unquote, Africans in tropical Africa are unanimous in stating that they show no clinical signs of dietary deficiency. One of the most striking indications of the superiority of indigenous Africans' diet is the magnificent conditions of the teeth. One researcher among 6 ethnic groups in Kenya could not find a single case of tooth decay, not a single deformation of dental arch. But when those same people were transplanted and put on the quote-unquote civilized diet available under colonialism, their teeth began to decay at once. 2. In Egypt, the peasants or felons, hold on, I'm gonna look at something here real quick, hold on. Up there. All right, he's laying on the couch. All right, I'm back here. Sorry, I had to make sure. 2. In Egypt, the peasants and the Felhanin, Fellahin, had always suffered from periodic famines, but under colonialism, this deteriorated to become chronic hunger. It was an intervention of the British which set up the balance of the peasants' diets in comparison with earlier accounts shows that there was once a much greater variety of legumes. I can't say this word, so let's go find out what it means. The words are hitting me today. G-U-M-E-S.
Thank you.
Yeah, legumes, which is, it has many. a leguminous plant, member of the pea family, especially one grown as a crop, a seed pod. Okay, thank you. And fruit. 3. The Cowicia Coro of the Oxfam poster is itself noticeable wherever the African's contact with the European was prolonged. A committee on nutrition in the colonial empire found a noticeable absence of animal fat and protein in the Gambian. The absence of proteins and good quality is one of the principal contributors to Kaiwashirakur, can't say the word anymore, and once again, comparison with the European saw in the Gambian ever since the 15th century would indicate that the change had come about after the coming of the whites. The Gambian not only grew a variety of food in the earlier period, but it was stock raising country where meat was consumed in a considerable quantity. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, cattle hides were sold by the thousands to European buyers every year, and the local population ate the meat. How then could they have suffered from the absence of animal fat? Number 4. Studies of the equatorial Africa have revealed frequent signs of dietary deficiencies caused by the absence of fresh foods among Africans entering the service of the colonizer. These include, oh my gosh, I can't say this word, beriberi, rackets, and scurvy. Rackets is a typical temperate climate disease to which lack of sun contributes. But after colonialism had so destroyed the pattern of judicious food consumption in tropical Africa, even the sun was not enough to keep children's bones straight. As for scurvy, that is so closely identified with the English sailor that he was nicknamed Lemmy, quote unquote, from eating limes to prevent scurvy while lacking access to fresh food on long sea voyages. However, a scurvy endemic broke out in the middle of Tanganyika in the colonial epoch among workers in the gold fields, and whose wages and conditions of work did not permit them to get fresh circus and other nourishment. Number 5. In South Africa, white settlers and capitalism transformed African diet from meat and cereal to dependency on mealie meal, maize, M-A-I-Z-E, palagra, or rough skin, quote unquote, was unknown in South Africa until about 1914. Subsequently, it became a scourge among Africans because it derives from the absence of milk and meat. Number 6. An official report of the Basutoland, now Lesotho, Lesotho, had this to say, quote, according to residents, a long-standing of physique and health of the Basuto today is not what it used to be. Malnutrition is seen in every village. Oh my gosh, I'm having troubles with words today. I don't know why. It's the simple words that are getting me. Always the simple words. Okay, dispensary, schools, or recruiting office. Mild scurvy and oh my gosh, succorbic conditions are not infrequent. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna look up this word. Pellarga. Can't, oh my gosh, it won't let me do it. Okay. Pellagra is becoming more and more frequent, and lower resistance to disease increasingly apparent. It is becoming generally accepted to that the occurrence of leprosy is associated with faulty diet. So that word is a disease that causes deficiency in vitamin B. To clinch the argument that colonialism was a deterrorist effect. Oh my gosh, I gotta look at this word. It's kind of annoying. Deleterious, okay. To clench the argument that colonialism had a deleterious effect on the African as a physical and hence mental entity, it is useful to point out that those African people who until today have managed to maintain their own pattern of existence insofar as food is concerned, the pastoral Messiah, Gala, Akulo, Batutsi, and Somali are all in that category. Their physique is generally so superb, their resistance and endurance so great, that they have become the objects of scientific research to discover why they do so much better than the well-fed capitalists who are collapsing from heart disease. In the light of the prevailing balance sheet concept of what colonial rule was about, it still remains to take note of European innovations in Africa, such as modern medicines, clinical surgery, and immunization. And it would be absurd to deny that these were objectively positive features. However, limited they were quantitatively. However, they have to be weighed against the numerous setbacks received by Africa in all spheres due to colonialism, as well as against the contribution of Africa made to Europe. European science met the needs of its own society, and particularly those of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie did not suffer from hunger and starvation. Bourgeois science, therefore, did not consider those things as needs which had to be met and overcome, not even among their own workers, and at least of all on behalf of Africans. This is just a specific application of the general principles that the exploitation of Africa was being used to create a greater gap between Africa and the capitalist Europe, and exploitation of the comparative disadvantage, or are the ingredients of underdevelopment. Education and underdevelopment. All right. Sorry about all the delays, everybody. Looking ahead real quick. See how much, I still have long ways to go. All right. Let me look back at something here. Not too many people coming up. Quite okay. All right, good evening. Hello, hi, Kami. Okay, sweet. Education for underdevelopment. Education is crucial to any type of society for the preservation of the lives of its members and the maintenance of the social structure. Under certain circumstances, education also promotes social change. The greater portion of that education is informal, being acquired by the young from the example and behavior of elders in society. Under normal circumstances, education grows out of the environment, the learning process being directly related to the pattern of work in the society. Among the Bimba of what was then Northern Rhodesia, children by the age of 6 could name 50 to 60 species of tree plants without hesitation, but they knew very little about ornamental flowers. The explanation is simple. It's simply that knowledge of the trees was a necessity in an environment of, quote, cut and burn, end quote, agriculture. And in a situation where numerous households' needs were met by tree products. Flowers, however, were irrelevant to survival. Indeed, the most crucial aspects of pre-colonial African education was its relevance to Africans. In sharp contrast with what was later introduced, the following features of indigenous African education can be considered outstanding. In its close links with social life, both in the material and the spiritual sense, its collective nature, its many-sidedness, and its progressive development in conformity with the successive stages of physical, emotional, and mental development of the child. There was no separation of education and productive activity, or any division between manual and intellectual education. Altogether, through mainly informal means, pre-colonial African education matched the realities of pre-colonial African societies and produced well-rounded personalities to fit into that society. Some aspects of African education was formal. That is to say, there was a specific program and a conscious division between teachers and pupils. Formal education in pre-colonial Africa was also directly connected with the purpose of society, just like informal education. The programs of teaching were restricted to certain periods in the life of every individual, notably the period of initiation or, quote, the coming of age, end quote. Many African societies had circumcision ceremonies for males or for both sexes. And for some time before the ceremonies, a teaching program was arranged. The length of time involved could vary from a few weeks to several years. A famous example of the latter was the initiation school held by the Puro Brotherhood in Sierra Leone. Formal education was also available at later stages in life, such as the occasion of passing from one age grade to another, or of joining a new brotherhood. Specialized functions such as hunting, organizing religious rituals, and practice of medicines definitely involved formal education within the family or clan. Such educational practice all dated back to communal times in Africa, but they persisted in the more developed African feudal and pre-feudal societies. They were to be found on the eve of colonialism. As the mode of production moved towards feudalism in Africa, new features also emerged within the educational patterns. There was, for instance, more formal specialization because the proportion of formal and informal education increased with technological advance. Apart from hunting and religion, the division of labor made it necessary to create guides for passing down the techniques of iron working, leather making, cloth, manufacture, pottery molding, professional trading, and so on. The emphasis on military force also led to formal education in the sphere in the case of Dahomey, Rwanda, the Zulu cited earlier. The state structure within a well-defined ruling class always encouraged the use of history as a means of glorifying the class in power. So in the Yoruba state of Kut in the 19th century, there existed a school of history where the masters drilled into the memories of his pupil a long list of kings of Kutu and their achievements. Of course, reliance on memory alone placed several limits on education of that type, and that is why education was much more advanced in those African countries where the use of writing had come into being. Along the Nile, in North Africa, in Ethiopia, in Western Sudan, along the East African coast, a minority of Africans became literate, producing a situation comparable to that of Asia and Europe before the latter part of the 19th century. As in other parts of the world, literacy in Africa was connected to religion. So that the Islamic countries, in the Islamic country, it was the Quranic education, and the Christian Ethiopian, the education was designed to train priests and monks. Muslim education was particularly extensive at the primary level, and it was also available at the secondary and university level. In Egypt, there was a Al-Zahar University. In Morocco, the University of Fez, and in Mali, the University of Timbuktu, all testimony to the standard of education achieved in Africa before colonial intrusion. The colonizer did not introduce education in Africa. They introduced a new set of formal educational institutions, which partly supplemented and partly replaced those which were there before. It looks like that he went and talked about the education before the colonizers, and now we're on the education of the colonizer, I think. The colonial system also stimulated values and practices which amounted to new informal education. The main purpose of the colonial school system was to train Africans to help man the local administration at the lowest ranks and to stall the private capitalist firms owned by Europeans. In effect, that meant selecting new Africans to participate in the domination and exploitation of the continent as a whole. It was not the educational system that grew out of the African environment, or one that one that was designed to promote the most rational use of material and social resources. It was not an educational system designed to give young people confidence and pride as members of African society, but one which sought to instill a sense of difference towards all that was European and capitalist. Education in Europe was dominated by the capitalist class. The same class-based bias was automatically transferred to Africa, and to make matters worse, the racism and cultural boastfulness harbored by capitalism were also included in the package of colonial education. Colonial schooling was education for subordination, exploitation, the creation of mental confusion, and the development of underdevelopment. The European type school system hardly operated during the last 40 years or so of colonialism. In that period, missionaries gave schooling for their own Christianizing process. And it was in the 1920s that the colonizing powers carried out a series of investigations into educational possibilities in Africa. Therefore, colonial education became systematic and measurable, though it approached its maximum dimensions only in the post-Second World War era. Colonial education was a series of limitations inside other limitations. The first practical limitation was political, financial, which means the political policies rather than an actual availability of money, guided financial expenditures. The metropolitan governments and their African administration claimed that there was not enough money for education. As late as 1958, the British Colonial Office said of North Rhodesia, here was what they said: until more money becomes available for the building of schools, no rapid progress can be expected, and the practical prospects of providing full primary education for all children therefore remains fairly remote. It is amazing that Northern Rhodesia, with its immense copper wealth, did not have enough money to educate Africans. One cannot be certain. Rather, the colonialists were trying to deceive others, or rather they had succeeded in fooling themselves. Probably most of the confused white settlers in Rhodesia fell into the latter category, for they constantly argued that Africans did not pay as much tax per head as Europeans, and therefore Africans could not expect to get education and other services out of taxes paid by white settlers. This is the fundamental failure of perceive that a country's wealth comes not from taxes but from production. African soil and African labor in North Rhodesia produced vast wealth, but African children under colonialism had little access to that wealth for their schooling. As noted earlier, most of Africa's surplus was exported, and out of the small portions which remained behind as government revenue, the percentage channeled into education was tiny. In every colony, the budget for education was incredibly small compared to the amounts being spent in capitalist Europe itself. In 1935, the total revenue collected from taxing Africans in French West Africa was 4.03%. Of Africa, only 4.03% was utilized on education. In the British colonies of Nigeria, it was only 3 to 4%. In Kenya, as late as 1946, it was 2.26% of the revenue was spent on African education. By the 1960s, those percentages had gone up 2 or 3 or 4 times. But being so small to begin with, they still remain inefficient. Since such small sums were spent, it followed that another basic limitation was quantitative, in the sense that very few Africans made it into schools in the whole of French Equatorial Africa, Chad, Central African Republic, Gabon, Congo, and Brazzaville. There were only 22,000 pupils enrolled in 1938, and that represented quite a jump over the figures for the preceding 5 years. In 1938, the French provided education for 77,000 pupils of French West Africa, which with the population of at least 15 million. And a very illuminating fact that should be noted is that in 1945, there were more than 80,000 students attending independent Islamic schools in French West Africa, a number not far short of those attending French-built schools by that date. In other words, it was only in the final stage of colonialism that the ruling European power began to provide Africans in the former Islamic states of West Africa with educational institutions having an enrollment greater than that of the previous formal education. Occasionally in West and North Africa, the French government gave financial support to the the Korenik primary school, and to the Madrisia, or the Islamic secondary schools. On the whole, however, the pre-colonial African school system was simply ignored, and it tended to decline. In Algeria, the Arabic Islamic institutions of learning suffered severely during the French wars of conquest, while others were deliberately suppressed when the French gained the upper hand. Throughout French North Africa, the old established Islamic universities suffered because colonialism deprived them of the economic base with which previously gave them support. As with so many other aspects of African life, what the colonialists put in must be weighed against what they halted and what they destroyed in both real and potential terms. British colonies tended to do, on average, somewhat better than French ones with regards to educational activities, largely because the missionary initiatives, rather than the British government itself, Ghana, Nigeria, Uganda, were fairly well off as far as colonial education went. Of course, that was in purely relative sense, and the absolute numbers involved were never large. Sierra Leone was better off educationally than French West African because of the 7 out of every 100 children going to school in Sierra Leone before the last war compared favorably with 5 out of every 100 of French West Africa. As far as the British are concerned, their slightly superior record in some colonies is also offset by the very poor educational facilities offered to Africans in Kenya, Tanganyika, and Central African territories. In South Africa itself, which was for a long time a British responsibility. One limitation of the educational system of colonial Africa, which is obscured by statistical averages, is the great variations of an opportunity between different regions in the same colony. In many colonies, only Africans living in or near the principal towns had educational opportunities. For instance, the Madagascar, the capital town of Tananarive, had the most substantial school facilities. In Gambia, literacy was higher for Bathurst town, but low outside, and in Uganda, an urbanized region of Buganda, practically monopolized education. Generally speaking, the unevenness of educational levels reflected the unevenness of economic exploitation and the different rates at which different parts of the colony entered the money economy. Thus, in the Gold Coast, the Northern Territories were neglected educationally because they did not offer the colonialists any products for export. In Sudan, it was a huge southern region which was in a similar position. Inside Tanganyika, a map showing the major cotton and coffee area virtually coincide with the map showing areas in which colonial education was available. It means that those whom the colonialists could not readily exploit were not offered even the crumbs of education. The closer one scrutinizes the educational contribution of colonialism, even in purely quantitative terms, the more it shrinks into insignificance. It must be noted, for instance, that there was an extremely high rate of dropouts, quote unquote. A large percentage of those enrolled never finished schools. In big capitalist countries like the United States, there are many dropouts at the college and university levels. In colonial Africa, the dropouts were occurring at the primary level at a rate as high as 50%, For every student, for every student who completed primary school, one fell by the wayside. The dropouts were from primary school because there was hardly any other type of school, was absence of secondary, technical, and university education, being yet another of the stumbling blocks. Africans were being educated inside colonial schools to become junior clerks and messengers. Too much now they're getting into what are they taught? Too much learning would have been both superfluous and dangerous for clerks and messengers. Therefore, secondary education was rare, and other forms of higher education were virtually non-existent. Throughout most of the colonial epoch, that which was provided went mainly to non-Africans. As late as 1959, Uganda spent about 11 pounds per African pupil, 38 pounds per Indian, and 168 pounds on each European child. The difference being due largely to the availability of secondary education for the children of the capitalists and the middlemen. In Kenya, the discrimination was worse. The number of European children involved was high. In 1960, more than 11,000 European children were attending school in Kenya, and 3,000 of those were receiving secondary education. The settler colony in Algeria displayed similar characteristics. Only 20% of the secondary pupils in 1954 were denoted as quote-unquote Muslims, which meant in effect Algerian, quote-unquote, as distinct from Europeans. Other minorities also did better than the indigenous population. For instance, the Jewish people in North Africa, and especially in Tunisia, played the middleman role, and their children were all educated right up to the secondary standards. African countries without a big white settler population also had racist educational structures with regard to opportunities at all levels, and especially opportunities for higher education. In Senegal, in 1946, the high school had 723 pupils, of whom 174 were Africans. Later on, a university was set up in Dakar to serve the whole of French West Africa. And yet, in the 1950s, on the eve of independence, more than half of the university students were French. The Portuguese have not been discussed so far because there is scarcely any education to be discussed in their colonial territories. For many years, the statistical data were never made available, and when published towards the end of the colonial periods, the figures were often inflated. What is undeniable is that the African child growing up in Portuguese colonial territories stood one chance out of 100 of getting instructions beyond grade 2 or grade 3. The secondary schools that came into existence were for Europeans and Indians from India. The latter draw mainly from Goa. The colonial powers with smaller territories in Africa were Spain and Italy. Like Portugal, they were also backwards from the European capitalist viewpoint, and they provided their colonial subjects with a tiny amount of primary education and no secondary education. Belgium was in a somewhat special category for as far as colonial education was concerned. Notice he's going now through all the colonial people. Although small, Belgium was a relatively developed and industrialized country, and it ruled one of the richest areas in Africa, namely the Congo. By colonial standards, the people of Congo and Rwanda, Urundi, had fair access to primary education, but schooling beyond that was almost impossible to obtain. This was the consequence of the deliberate policy pursued by the Belgian government and the Catholic Church. The African quote-unquote native was to be gradually civilized. To give him secondary education was like asking a young child to chew meat when he should be eating porridge. Furthermore, the Belgians were so interested in the welfare of African masses that they argued that, oh my gosh, you're gonna puke again, that no highly educated African would be able to serve his own people. Consequently, it was only in 1948 that the Belgian Commission recommended the establishment of secondary schools for Africans in the colonies. And it is not at all surprising that at the time of regaining political independency, the Congo had only 16 graduates out of the population of more than 13 million. Get down. Get down. Get down. Get down. I'm going to puke. I'm going to puke out here. All right, everybody hold on a second. Sorry about that. Almost, I think I said Congo had 16 graduates out of the population of more than 13 million. Yeah. Education was like, furthermore, I'm going to read this. Furthermore, the Belgians were so interested in the welfare of the African masses that they argued that no highly educated African would be able to serve his own people. Consequently, it was only in 1948 that the Belgian Commission recommended the establishment of secondary schools for Africans in the colonies. Hold on a second. All right, back. Sorry, buddy. It is not at all surprising that at the time of regaining political independence, the Congo had only 16 graduates out of the population of more than 13 million. Education often referred to, quote, the educational pyramid, comprising primary education as the base and going upward through secondary, teacher training, higher technical, and university facilities. The last named being so small that it could be represented as the point at the top of the pyramid. Throughout Africa, the primary base was narrow, and yet the pyramid sloped shallowly because so few of the primary students could continue beyond that level. Only in certain British colonies was the pyramid really completed by significant higher and university education. West Africa had, I don't know how to say this, was Arkimato and Yobo colleges apart from Fourier Bay, which was at university level. Ibadan and the University of Ghana also came into existence some years before the end of the colonial regime. In Sudan, there was Gordon College. Each involved university. Oh my gosh, hold on a second. What's he doing? Out! Get out! Get out! The University of, I can't say this word. It's Khartoum. And in East Africa, there was the Makerere University. The following data for the year. I'm going to look ahead real quick. I got to find a stopping point here soon. This is a long chapter, everybody. Following the data for the years 1958 could be used to illustrate the educational pyramid of South Rhodesia, where African education was not well favored. Total kindergarten enrollment was 227,000. In primary school, 77,000 entered grade 1. 10,000 made it to grade 6. Secondary education began with 3,000 pupils, and of whom only 13 made it to grade 12. In that year, there were no African graduates from the recently established University College in Salisbury, but by 1960s, there were 3. The final word of the quantity of education provided by Europe to Africa can be said in the form of a statistic at the beginning of the rule of the new African states. Some scholars have worked out the statistical index on education, whereby educational facilities are evaluated in numbers from 0 to 100, moving from the poorest to the most advanced. On that index, most African countries were below 10. I don't know why they say TEM, T-E-M. That's weird. In the developed exploiter countries and the socialist states are usually above 80. An UNESCO publication on education on Black independent Africa said, this is what they said, of this population of around 170 million, a little more than 25 million are of school age. And of these, nearly 13 million have no opportunity of going to school. And of the privileged, quote unquote, 12 million, less than half complete their primary education. Only 3 out of every 100 children see the inside of a secondary school, while not even 2 of every 1,000 have a chance to receiving some sort of higher education in Africa itself. The overall estimated illiteracy rate of 80 to 85% is nearly twice that of the average world figure. Ugh, horrible. The imperialist whites used the above evidence to. I'm gonna look up this word because it's too close to the N word, and I do not want to say it. Too close to the N word. Way too close. So I'm gonna look it up. There we go. I'm gonna mute real quick, everybody, so I can hear it. I'm just gonna say the definition. It's SNIGGER, which is laugh in a half suppressed, typical, scornful way. A half suppressed, typical, scornful laugh. Okay, I didn't want to take the chance at Africans for being, quote, illiterate natives. Oh my God, these fucking European bastards doing this on purpose. Salam alaikum. And they would argue that literacy is a part of, quote, the vicious cycle of poverty, end quote. Yet the same people boast proudly that they have educated Africa. Oh my gosh. It is difficult to see how they have, difficult to see how they can have it both ways. If independent Africa is still without the benefits of modern education as it is, then 75 years of colonial exploitation undoubtedly have something to do with the state of affairs. The absurdity is so much the greater than when one contemplates how much Africa produced in that period, and how much of that went to develop all aspects of European capitalist society, including their educational institutions. Cecil Rhodes could afford to leave the legacy of lavish scholarships of white students for studies at Oxford University, having made a fortune from exploiting Africa and Africans. I'm going to end there. That is a good stopping point. So yeah, the educational system was pertinent before colonialism. He went in and he talked about the educational systems in Africa and how were they conducive to the material conditions, to the needs of their society, that they had informal and formal. They had the mental and the physical. They had the education that was pertinent to their cultures, their society. Get down. 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 I want you to be doing it on my bed. Yeah, you can stay up here. You can stay here, but you're on the floor with me. Yeah, so they went over how like that was pertinent and how it was well developed before colonization. And then when the colonized came, they destroyed all those avenues, approaches, and instead just gave them no education. And then they gave them some education because they needed them to engage in certain production. And they weren't given higher education because like they made it completely impossible for them to get to go up to there. As you can tell, like they said that 3 people were in the universities. So like they did that, and then they made it only pertinent to European society, to European development, and that was it. They did not teach them anything pertinent to their material conditions, to their societies, to engaging with improving and developing those things. So yes, and we ended on page 300. What a page to end on, 300. And we're gonna learn more. Like there's still more to go. Like those Africans who we're gonna still talk more about education. You know what I mean? So he's going through that. The underdevelopment part was not expanding destroying their educational process and bringing on this European process that most of them couldn't engage because they wouldn't create enough school facilities or teachers. What's up?
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to bring up, was the fact of the education and how they purposely set them up to fail, and how they refused to give money for the schools, and then on top of that was expecting them to learn a European-based education. It was like teaching. It's like when we say we don't expect a fish to be able to climb a tree, we shouldn't judge them based on it. We were expecting fish to climb trees.
Mm-hmm.
Very poorly funded trees at that.
Yeah. Thank you for whoever, thank you, Little Lizard. Thank you for being willing to say it. But I just didn't want to accidentally say something I'm not supposed to. So it is basically snickering, like ha 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 ha, doing that. That's what it was. But yeah, this is the whole meaning. This is what Walter Rodney talks about in this book: is what is development? What does development look like? What is underdevelopment? And how were things underdeveloped? You know what I mean? And even different countries, and how the underdevelopment came, and how that underdevelopment made the Western societies develop through the exploitation and pillaging and stuff. But, all right. Does anybody else have anything else to say? Nope.
Not I.
All right. I hope everybody enjoys. We're almost finished with this. The next book, of course, will be Grounding with My Brothers. I think that's one of his first his first works, his Grounding with My Brothers. It's going to be on the conditions of, you'll see. It's a good book. I think it's a great book. And we're almost done. Like, how much more do we have left? Let me see. I think this might be the last chapter, but this chapter's so long. Let me look ahead real quick. This is a long chapter. All right, let me see here. All right, development by contradiction. Okay, cool. That's the next section. I'm looking ahead, everybody. Sorry. That's gonna be quite a long one too. Come on. And then postscript. Yeah, and then postscript, and then we'll be done. So we got the end of this chapter, then postscript, and then we're done. So we're at page 300, and we only have 54 more pages to go. So not too long. All right, if no one else has anything to say about what we talked about, I'm going to go ahead and close it down. I thank everybody who gave as much as they can, who stuck around and listened. I hope everyone's well.